Hey everyone, it's good to be with you again. We are now in our final unit for the course. This is the unit on value and obligation. And I'm going to split, there are four, I want to say four lectures. There may be five, but I think there's only four. I'm going to split, I'm going to do all of what's covered in the lecture notes, I'm going to do in two videos. So this one is going to be value and obligation 1 and 2. And then the second video will be whatever remains, 3 and 4, or 3, 4, and 5. If there's 5, I think there's only 4. And then we'll be done with the course. I am almost done grading the last tests. I have about, I want to say around 15 left, and so it's going to be another day or two, but they will all be back soon. And so let's get right down to it. Let's get right down to the material and value and obligation. So first of all, let's just talk about the concept of value. What do we mean when we talk about value in philosophy? What we mean when we talk about value in philosophy are things that are good, things that are to be aimed for. In modern language, you might say things that are desirable. But when we talk about value, we're talking about what's good and what's bad in the sense of what is desirable and undesirable, what one should aim at and what one should not aim at. We are not talking directly about obligation, although as you'll see as we go on, there's an important relationship between value and obligation. Certainly our conception of value informs our conception of obligation, but the two notions are distinct and have to be understood separately in order to understand how they interact. There's a fundamental difference between the way that in the West philosophers approach the subject of value in the pre-modern era, that is prior to the initial scientific revolution and Enlightenment, and then how philosophers predominantly approach the question of value after it, right? So let's sort of talk about each of these in turn. In the ancient world, value is fundamentally understood in terms of the fulfillment of a thing's purpose, right? So one way to think about what's good, what ought to be aimed at is in terms of that which something is for, right? So in a very obvious and not very exciting sense, this cup has a purpose, right? The purpose of the cup is to put stuff in it to drink. And so what it is to be a good cup, what we value in a cup is that it performed that function well, right? So what makes this a good cup is that it's large enough to hold enough liquid that it's worth drinking from it, that it doesn't leak. All the things that we would take to be valuable in this sense, good about the cup, have to do with the fulfillment of its function. Now, this is a perfectly easy to understand notion with respect to cups and things like this. But you have to understand that in the pre-modern world, this is how everything was thought about, including the things that belong to nature and including human beings, right? That is, everything in nature, everything in existence is thought to have a purpose, and therefore a distinctive good attached to it, right? So on this way of thinking, human beings have a purpose simply by virtue of being human beings. That human being is a purpose-laden concept, and that therefore there is something that it is to be a good human being and something that it is to be a not good human being, in the same sense as there is to being a good cup and a bad cup. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that this notion of good and bad human being is not inherently from the beginning a moral notion. It's simply the idea that what it is to be a good human being is to fulfill the human purpose. Now, what is probably significant about this is that this renders the human good something objective, right? Because if human beings are taken to have a purpose in nature, right? That is, as a matter of nature, we have a purpose. And I want you to contrast this with the idea of a purpose that one sort of takes on for oneself, right? So, if I ask a modern person, if I ask one of you, what is your purpose? You're very likely going to answer me by referring to some aspect of your plans for yourself. My purpose, I'm going to go to law school. I'm going to become a lawyer. I want to be a public defense attorney to help, give legal defense to people who don't have any money, whatever, and all that, right? Those are all purposes that you, in a sense, assign to yourself. They reflect the things that you've decided that you want to do. And thus, what's going to count as good to you is going to depend in part about whether those self-appointed, self-chosen purposes are fulfilled or not. In the pre-modern way of thinking, the sense in which a human being has a purpose has nothing to do with the particular ends and aims that one assigns oneself. One intrinsically has a purpose by virtue of being a human being. Right? Now, if you want to ask, well, where does that come from? I mean, how does this things in nature have a purpose? I mean, I understand how cups have purposes because people make them for specific reasons. But how do things in nature have purposes? And the answer is very simple. You have to remember that in the pre-modern era, the entire view of the world was infused with the idea of there being divinities, gods, right? Gods in the case of the Greek, or a god in the case of the Abrahamic traditions. And so the idea that, in a sense, nature is infused with purpose is because nature is a thing created by God or the gods, right? In that sense, all of existence is like the cup in that it's made on purpose. And so everything in it has a purpose, right? And so what that means is that the sense in which someone like, let's say, an Aristotle, who's the most famous of the pre-modern ancient Greek theorists with respect to human flourishing and the human good, right? So someone like Aristotle thinks is that, look, human beings by nature have a purpose. And what it is to be a good human being is to fulfill that purpose in some way. Now, what is that human purpose? The way that Aristotle answers that question, and if you think about it, if you think of the universe of reality as a created thing, right? Aristotle's way of approaching this makes perfect sense. Aristotle says, look, if you want to know what the human purpose is, the first thing we need to ask is, well, what is the human essence? What is the defining property of a human being, or properties if there's more than one? And for Aristotle, the answer to that lies in the distinctive human combination of embodiment, which he takes us to share with all the animals, and then reason, which he takes us to share with the divine. And the funny thing is, in this sense, Aristotle and the Greeks are really not very different from the Abrahamic traditions either. When we say man is made, in the Abrahamic traditions, they say man is made in the image of God. They don't mean that you look like him, right? It's not like God, is a fat middle-aged man with 5 o'clock shadow, right? What they mean is that, we are made in the image in the sense that we share some attribute. And obviously the attribute that we share is not our physicality or our embodiment. That's an attribute that we share with the animals. What the attribute that we share with God, according to the Abrahamic tradition, again, very much like the Greeks, is this mind-oriented attribute, right? The capacity to reason, right? And Aristotle then goes on more to say, and that capacity to reason has to be broken down into two further capacities. Right? We are able to reason in two ways. By the way, I'm now going to introduce a distinction that you're already familiar with, because it goes all the way back to the initial lectures on reasoning. This is our good old distinction between practical or deliberative reasoning and the more kind of intellectual or contemplative or theoretical sort of reasoning, whatever you want to call it. The first being the kind of reasoning that we apply to our actions, right? So when we reason deliberatively, we primarily reason about what we should do in some particular set of circumstances and contexts. And the latter sort of reasoning is the sort of reasoning that we employ when we are engaged in the pursuit of knowledge and the attempt to discover what's true and what's false, right? Both of these types of reasoning, and specifically the combination of those kinds of reasoning with an embodied existence, is the human essence. It's what makes us unique. It's what defines us. It defines our place in the order of reality. Right? Now, given that that's our essence, Aristotle thinks that we can from then derive our purpose and therefore our good, right? If our essence is if our essence is essentially embodied rationality, then Aristotle is going to want to say our purpose, again, as a species, not as self-designated, our purpose simply by virtue of what we are, is to live embodied lives under the guidance of reason. So long as we do that, we are fulfilling our purpose and thus attaining the good for human beings. Right? We are valuable human beings insofar as we fulfill that purpose. Now, what does that cash out into real, actual life? Well, if you think about all the different contexts in which we lead our embodied lives, and within which we can apply reason, we get a number of what I would just call archetypes of human flourishing, of human goodness. Okay? So one context in which we live our embodied lives is socially, as part of social organizations, right? Social, right, from the family all the way up to the state. So that's one area of life to which we can apply our capacity for deliberative reason. And that's what yields moral and political life, right? Right? That's where all the moral and the civic virtues lie, is in the successful application of reason to our embodied existence within the social frame. And so one archetype of a valuable human being in this sense will be the morally upstanding person and the good citizen. Right? Another context in which we lead our embodied lives is in the broad context of what I would call making and creating, let's say. I'm looking for a word that's going to include everything from an artist to a cabinet maker to a bridge builder. These are also contexts in which we lead embodied lives. All of these activities involve embodiment, meaning action, right? And they're also all areas of life to which we can apply deliberative reason. The choices that the artist, the craftsman, and the engineer makes in the doing of their business involves constant applications of deliberative reason, just within different domains. And so a second archetype of a good human being, in the sense that we've been talking about, is going to be the artist, the master craftsman, the engineer, right? Now, the final sphere in which we lead our lives, the final context in which we lead our lives, is the intellectual context. Now, this is the one that Aristotle thinks least involves our embodiment. It's essentially a life of the mind. In certain practical senses, it involves our embodiment. We have to go to libraries, we have to, do experiments, we have to do all sorts of, things like that. But it's much less involves activity, embodied activity, than the others. This is what Aristotle calls the contemplative life, but really what he means is more like the life of scholarly pursuit. This is another way we can be good human beings in the sense we've meant all along. But in this sense, the primary mode of reason that we're exercising is not deliberative, but the other kind. So these are all ways in which we can fulfill our purpose as human beings, a purpose that is attached to our very nature. It's not a matter of personal decisions and choices. This is the way that we can flourish as human beings. This is the way that we can have the life of what Aristotle calls eudaimonia, which simply is the Greek word for human flourishing. And notice that while one of them, the life of the citizen and the state, the good citizen, the morally upright person and the good citizen, involves what we would call moral virtues, the overall sense of sort of the good of a human being is not in itself intrinsically a moral idea. It happens to have a moral realization in one of its aspects because human beings engage in social life and social activity. But eudaimonia is not an intrinsically moral notion. And what you see is that, and you see this in all the ancient Greek, most of the ancient Greek literature, and in Aristotle you see it very clearly, they simply just don't have that conception of obligation that we have, right? If you want to flourish in the social sphere, then you're going to be morally virtuous, right? But if your flourishing occurs primarily, let's say, in the artistic and let's say in the scholarly, that's not going to be a life defined primarily by moral virtue. So the idea that one is obligated to be morally virtuous is not a general principle for Aristotle. It's simply the life of moral virtue is one way in which a human being can be a good human being. Now you might say, well, where does that conception of moral obligation, universal kind of moral obligation, come from? That comes from a wedding of the ancient Greek notion of moral and civic virtue with the kind of law tradition that you get out of the Abrahamic, right? Basically, when you wed the law tradition that comes out of Judaism, out of Torah, right? Torah, which just means law, right? Right. Once you wed that law tradition from the Abrahamic with the virtue tradition, the conception of moral virtue from the Greek, you get our Western modern conception of universal moral obligation. Basically, our view is that we essentially have a universal obligation to be morally virtuous in the manner that the Greeks understood. Right? That's where we get our distinctive conception of moral obligation from. So what I'm going to want to say is that the notion of moral obligation that we are all most familiar with, this idea that there's sort of universal obligations and duties that we all fall under, that is a fundamentally Western, in the sense of synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem tradition, right? And that's something that we need to keep in mind when we shift back and forth from the ancient Greeks to modern ethicists like, let's say, Mill or Kant, right? We need to understand that when someone like Mill says moral and someone like Aristotle says moral, they don't mean the same thing. When Aristotle says moral, he simply is talking about flourishing within the social sphere, right? When we talk about the moral, we're talking about fulfilling sort of universal obligations, right? These are very different sort of notions, and it's important to keep them separate, although, as you've seen, they're very interestingly related. Okay, so what happens in the modern era? Well, in the modern era, what happens is that nature is no longer viewed as having purpose, right? Right? Once you get to the first scientific revolution and then the subsequent scientific revolutions, one thing that they all have in common is they remove this idea of the agency of God or the gods from the fundamental understanding of nature. If the ancient Greeks had a purposeful conception of nature, after the scientific revolution and ongoing scientific revolutions, that was replaced with what I will broadly call a mechanistic view of human nature, right? Not just of human nature, of all of nature. Now you might say, well, why would you do that? Why would you want to do that? It's going to make all the stuff about ethics and morality much more difficult. The answer is very simple. You do that because these scientific revolutions were so powerful in their capacity to explain and predict the things in the world that they gave us unprecedented control, not only over the world, but over our fates in it. I mean, this is, without that scientific revolution, without this shift from a purpose-oriented universe to a mechanistic universe, you would not have had the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you would not have, we would not, the world would be unrecognizable to us now, given that we've been living within a modern scientific industrial framework now for hundreds of years, right? So this sort of development simply was inexorable. It was not, you could not stop this development as mightily as, for example, the Catholic Church tried to stop this development. It was not stoppable simply because the new scientific framework were just simply too powerful as epistemic and predictive instruments, right? But now, if there's no purpose in nature, then there's no sense in which, there's a sort of a good that just attaches to the thing in and of itself. So in the modern framework, whether something is valuable or good is entirely a matter of whether it matters to someone. Right? Cups are good because having things that hold liquid without spilling matters to us. If we didn't care about that, there'd be nothing good about the fact that this cup doesn't leak, right? It's not that somehow intrinsically leakiness is bad. Leakiness is bad given the things that we care about, right? So in a sense, value in the modern framework becomes, in a very fundamental, basic sense, subjective, in that it is perceiver dependent. Things don't just matter, they matter to someone. In the ancient world, things just mattered because they were built, the mattering was built into nature. Now, you could say that in the ancient world, value still ultimately was subjective because, the way that essences and purposes and thus goods got into nature was because of natures made by gods. So really, you could say value in the ancient world is just as subjective. It's just that, who the values ultimately matter to are the gods rather than us. But as a practical matter, at the ground level, they're really fundamentally different, right? It's one thing to say that, what it is to be a good human being is to have character, is to function in such a way as to fulfill a purpose that's not determined by me, but by my nature. As opposed to saying that what it is to be good is to do or fulfill something that matters to somebody. Those are very different things. Just even if you want to argue that at some sort of meta level, they really are the same. Because of this separation of fact and value, because that's what we're really talking about, right? Before, in the pre-modern era, values and facts are all mixed together. That one as a human being is both a fact and something that carries with it all sorts of values. In the modern era, those get separated. There are facts and then there are values, and the values lie in people's perception of the facts, right? And this also gets us earns us what is called the Isaught Gap, right? So in Aristotle's day, various value claims would follow from simple descriptions of things in nature. What something is would straightforwardly determine what ought to be, right? Now, there is no direct relationship between what is to what ought to be. The famous formula in philosophy articulating this is that you cannot derive an ought from an is. From the fact that something is the case, nothing follows logically as to what ought to be the case. What ought to be the case depends not just on what is the case, but on what people think about and care about with regard to what is the case. And so this makes ethics and morality much more difficult in the modern era, right? And it's not a surprise that, part of what really characterizes the modern era that you really couldn't say about the pre-modern world is much of what characterizes modern life is profound moral disagreement and dilemma, right? Which simply wouldn't have been the case in the pre-modern era, right? Because that conception of what purpose and value was sort of fixed, and for us it's variable. My purposes and what I care about may be totally different from your purposes and what you care about, and yet somehow we have to negotiate with each other in the public sphere. Right? This is part of the reason why I would argue liberal democracies are the best forms of government, because they make an effort to sort of create a fair playing field in which we can have those negotiations. All right, so that pretty much sums up the material for the most part that's in the first set of lecture notes. And let me now turn to the second. Okay. So now we're going to go firmly moving into the modern framework, right? And I want to talk about, and specifically we're going to focus on theories of obligation. And I just want to talk about the two most well-known, important to know, to be a basically educated person, modern views on moral obligation, and that is the views that we associate with utilitarianism, the most famous proponent of which was the philosopher John Stuart Mill, and the second is what's called Kantian deontology, which reflects the thinking of the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Right? Immanuel Kant is a philosopher of the 1700s. John Stuart Mill is a philosopher of the 1800s. Okay. And I'm just going to sort of give the basic, standard, talking points on each one. I'm going to say nothing original or new here, just enough to give you enough of an understanding of each that you can sort of, see how these competing notions of obligation play out in your own lives and in your interactions with others. Let's start with utilitarianism, not because it's the first, it's not, it comes after Kant, but because it's the easiest, right? Utilitarianism is based on a hedonic conception of value. And what that means is it takes as fundamentally valuable happiness. It says the one thing that that matters to every individual person, and not just matters as a fundamental matter, is happiness. And by happiness, the utilitarian means the experiencing of pleasure and the avoiding of pain. The utilitarian says this is really the only thing that matters to everyone, and also matters to everyone fundamentally. It is thus what utilitarians are going to call intrinsically good. Right? Meaning good in itself, rather than instrumentally good, by which we mean good as a means to some other good. So I don't want you to be confused. It's not saying that something intrinsically is good, saying that happiness is intrinsically good for the utilitarian is not saying that it's sort of objective in the way Aristotle thought that human flourishing was objective. What Mill means, what the utilitarians mean when they say that happiness is intrinsically good, is that it's not good because it makes possible some other good. It's good because it is the end. It is the end to which all the other goods are instruments. And it's universal to the degree to which everyone, or at least every normal in the in the sense of sound person, cares fundamentally, intrinsically about his or her own happiness. Okay. Now, from this conception of value, that the fundamental intrinsic good is happiness in the sense of pleasure in the absence of pain, the utilitarian straightforwardly builds a notion of obligation. Our obligation is to maximize what is fundamentally valuable, right? Which means our fundamental obligation is to increase the amount of happiness in the world and to decrease the amount of unhappiness in the world. Right? Very straightforward and very obviously related to the conception of value. So in utilitarianism, you have the tightest, cleanest relationship between the theory of what's valuable on the one hand and the theory of what we are obligated to do on the other. This belongs to a broader category of moral theory called consequentialism. And what all consequentialist views have in common, utilitarianism is simply the most prominent and well-known, what all consequentialist views have in common is that they place the ultimate basis of what is obligatory and what is prohibited lies in whether the consequences of whatever it is are good or bad. Right, so for the utilitarian, right, utilitarianism is consequentialist in that it says that our obligations are rooted in whether the outcomes of our actions are good or bad. In this case, whether they create happiness or unhappiness. You could, in principle, have a virtue consequentialist, right? You could have somebody who glues together Aristotle with consequentialism, and on that view, it would say, okay, our obligation is based in whichever of the outcomes of our actions most advance human flourishing, right? But consequentialism in the modern era is almost overwhelmingly utilitarian. And so these distinctions I just simply want to make you aware that utilitarianism also occupies a sort of broader category of type of theory. And the reason why this is important is because it's in Kant is a non-consequentialist. So the main reason for making these sort of distinctions is to set up, when we talk about Kant, to the way in which Kant is different. So for a consequentialist, what fundamentally determines our obligations is what are the good and the bad consequences of our actions, right? What I'm obligated to do is that which produces good consequences. What I'm obligated to not do is that which produces bad consequences. And the utilitarian interprets good and bad consequences as increasing pleasure and decreasing pain, or the opposite, right? Now, let me just sort of talk about just a few of the very common objections you'll hear to utilitarianism before I turn around and talk about Kant. Here's one here's one criticism that's often leveled at utilitarianism, and that's what I'm going to call the unfairness problem. Utilitarianism saddles us with the obligation of ensuring good outcomes. But as I hope everyone will realize, and as we'll come up with Kant shortly, a lot of times, no matter what we do, we really don't have very much control over what the ultimate outcomes of our actions are. And that's because the outcomes of our actions don't just depend on us. They depend on a whole bunch of things that we don't control. So I can try, I suppose I see it, a girl, drowning in Lake Springfield, and I run and jump in, according to utilitarianism, I have an obligation to save her, right? Because to save her will increase happiness, and to let her drown will decrease happiness, right? And so I jump in and I swim furiously to save her. But now suppose that, just by bad luck, I'm a terrible swimmer. Or by bad luck, it turns out she's already been in there for like hours and just can't tread water anymore. So it doesn't matter how fast I swim, I'm just not going to get to her. The point is that the end result of my outcome, my action, is going to be failure. The outcome of my action is going to be that the girl drowns. It would seem rather grotesque and unfair, however, to say that I'd done something wrong or that I'd violated my obligation, because I had really no power over the outcome. So this is sort of one objection that's levied at utilitarianism, is that the whole thing is kind of unfair. It saddles with people with a duty to produce good outcomes, and geez, I mean, how much control over the outcomes do we really have? Another problem that's typically levied at utilitarianism is what I'm going to call the impracticality problem. Look, it's not much good to have a theory of obligation if it doesn't actually help you determine what you ought to do. Right? The problem is that in order for utilitarianism to help you decide what you ought to do, outcomes need to be predictable. Right? If a theory is telling me, well, you ought to do that, you're obligated to do that which is going to produce good outcomes, and obligated to do that which doesn't produce bad ones, that kind of presupposes that I'm able to know in advance whether my action is going to produce a good or bad outcome. Now, in some cases, that may be obvious or seem obvious. Right? If I just walk up to somebody and punch them, if I know that if I just walk up to some random person and punch them in the face, it's much more likely to produce unhappiness than happiness, right? But how many things are really like that? And even that one. Suppose the guy that I go punch in the face, it turns out is like the worst person in the world and treats everybody terribly, and my punching him in the face caused him to have a sort of to think twice, and he behaves better. It could actually have a good result. Now that may be unlikely with that sort of action, but my raising it is to point out really that most actions are much more ambiguous than that, what their outcomes are going to be. So there's an impracticality problem, is that it's not clear that I know in advance enough about whether the outcomes of an action I'm contemplating are going to be good or bad, such that the theory really helps me in making a decision of how to act. Let me just say one last objection that is often raised. This is the most common. That's what I'm going to call the sort of the perverse outcomes objective. One of the problems is that utilitarianism will often yield results that seem obviously wrong, right? It's going to tell you that you're obligated to do things that seem obviously not the right things to do. Like, for example, if, let's say, it turned out, let's go back in time, and let's say we were able to figure this out through very complex and rigorous sociological analysis. Let's say we found out that Roman gladiator games definitely created more happiness than unhappiness. Let's just stipulate that we know that. We're then in the very strange position of saying that Romans forcing people to fight to the death in the arena not only was not immoral, but obligatory. Now this seems crazy. Utilitarian can't explain why, but I would argue that actually this is sort of one of the basic conditions of adequacy that a theory has to meet, right? If a theory of obligation is telling us too often that we're obligated to do things that strike us as just the wrong thing to do, that strikes me as a decisive blow against it. But notice what that means. That means that ultimately our test for an adequacy of a moral philosophy or moral theory depends on our pre-theoretical intuitions already about what's moral, obligatory, and not. That is, their enormous role is played by intuition. And if ultimately whatever we say about moral obligation is going to be constrained by what intuitively we will accept, right? The point and purpose and function of the moral theorizing now becomes more somewhat obscure, right? And so that's just something I want, it's a very prominent criticism of utilitarianism, but it's something I want you to sort of keep in mind as we go forward in this unit. All right, let me talk about Kant now. Kant has Immanuel Kant has an entirely different approach to morality than the utilitarians. For Kant, morality is fundamentally a function of two things about us: our rationality and our freedom, our agency. Not on our capacity to feel pleasure and pain. Right? For the utilitarian, the fundamental thing about us that determines how we should think about obligation is the fact that we're creatures capable of feeling pleasure and pain. For Kant, the most fundamental thing about us that guides and determines how we think about obligation is the fact that we are rational and capable of acting freely. Right? And from this starting point, you get an entirely different picture of morality. If you think about those two aspects, the capacity to reason and our ability to act freely, you'll understand that for Kant, one of the most fundamental sort of constraining principles is that ought, O-U-G-H-T, implies can, right? That there's a fundamental mistake involved when we say that someone is obligated to do something that they're not actually capable of doing. Now, this goes right to the question of where we should focus our moral attention. The utilitarian and the consequentialist more generally focuses our attention on the outcomes. But as we just discussed in our discussion of utilitarianism, in truth, we don't have that much control over the outcomes of our actions. Therefore, when the utilitarian says to us, we are commanded, we are obligated to affect good outcomes, the utilitarian, as far as Kant is concerned, is violating the ought implies can principle. We just can't do that. I can't control the weather. I can't control whether a girl's been in a lake too long. I can't control the fact that, I didn't learn, nobody taught me to swim when I was 6 years old, right? And yet the utilitarian is saying I'm obligated to affect good outcomes despite the fact that I cannot. So we cannot control our outcomes. And so whatever Kant's moral philosophy is going to say we're obligated to do, it's not going to be to obtain good consequences or good outcomes. What Kant thinks is that the only thing we actually really have control over is our own will. What we aim and decide and implement. How it turns out crosses beyond the border of what we can control. But within that frame, we have complete control. So for Kant, what makes actions right or obligatory is not right or good outcome, it's right or good motive. So if you want to know why in ethics, if you think about ethics in your life, right, whenever moral questions come up, right, when you think about this, the two things that are always revolving around are what are the outcomes, are they good or bad, and what is the person's motive who I'm dealing with, or what are my motives? Now you know where these two roots come from. They come from the utilitarians and from the Kantians, right? And I would argue both are obviously morally relevant, but each philosopher, the utilitarian and the Kantian, sort of takes on board one part but rejects the other. And part of what's so hard about moral philosophy in the modern era has been to try and construct some sort of theory that embraces both ideas. And you can see why that would be very hard. Kant has a pretty darn good reason for saying that consequences and outcomes can't be what's morally determinative, because we don't have control over them. And yet at the same time, how can it not morally be significant that I hurt somebody, right? Or that I help somebody? So for Kant, unlike for the utilitarian, what our obligations depend on, what the rightness of our actions depend upon, is not whether they produced a good outcome, but whether they are the result of our willing rightly. Now, for Kant, what willing rightly involves is willing in such a way that one could rationally require others to will in such a way. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. I mean, that's kind of obscure. To go into a lot of the details would just be to sort of take us down a Kant hole that would require a lot of work that we don't have time for. I'm mostly interested in you understanding the distinction between a theory of morality that bases obligation in the obtaining of good outcome or right outcome versus a theory of obligation that's based in the idea of good or right intention or motive. Right? That's the basic split I want you to grasp, and to start looking at your own life and seeing it in all these places. Right? Just examine any moral dilemma or moral situation you found yourself in recently, and I bet you'll find in it both considerations of the goodness or badness of the outcomes for the various actors and the goodness and badness of the motives of the various actors. I guarantee you'll find that at every single moral situation you confront. And so it's important to understand each and to understand the role of each and to understand these sort of theories that have been built around each. Okay, that I think is enough for today. And next time we will complete. The next lecture I will complete the unit on value and obligation. As always, it's wonderful to talk to you. I hope you're all doing okay, and I'll see you in the next video.